It's Friday night. You're at Applebee's, you're watching the game, you're 4, 5, 6 drinks in, and you decide, let me drive my car instead of getting an Uber. You get in your car, you make that stupid decision, you're driving, and all of a sudden you see those red and blue lights in your mirror. Well, what do you do? In this video, I'm gonna tell you exactly what you should do next, and I'm also gonna tell you what you shouldn't do. So the first thing I wanna say is this is not a get out of jail free card. In New Jersey, if you drive drunk or tipsy and you get pulled over, you're most likely gonna get arrested. You have to remember that it's not illegal to have a drink and then drive. It's illegal to be intoxicated and drive. So when an officer pulls you over, that's exactly what they're looking for. They're looking to see if you're actually intoxicated and if they have probable cause to start conducting the tests necessary to confirm whether or not you're intoxicated. So the very first thing you should do if you see those red and blue lights flashing in your rearview mirror is to pull over in a safe and clear spot. So the first thing you wanna do is look for a good parking lot to get into or a wide margin of the highway where there's sometimes a shoulder. Sometimes part of that shoulder is a little bit wider. Sometimes there's a parking lot. Sometimes there's a shopping mall coming up. You want to pull into there. And the reason why that's important, besides the fact that it's for your safety, the officer's safety, and other cars that are flying by, you want to act like a sober person. And what would a sober person do if they're being pulled over? Well, they usually want to pull over in a safe manner. They'll usually do it slow. They'll usually use their signal. So those are all good things that'll help you fight a DUI. Because like I said, if you're pulled over and you're actually drunk or you're tipsy, you're most likely going to get arrested. But when the case comes to me, what I want to do is reverse engineer that case. And I want to look for situations where, well, you weren't really acting like a drunk person or intoxicated person. You were acting like a sober, reasonable person. So that's the very first thing. Second thing is, don't get out of your car. Don't think that you're going to bolt out of your car and start reasoning with the officer and explaining to him or her as to why they shouldn't have pulled you over and why they're being ridiculous. No, stay in your car. If you could turn off your car, that'd be great. Put your keys on the dash, put your hands on the steering wheel. When the officer comes up to the window, they're most likely gonna ask you a couple questions. Where are you going? Where are you coming from? My advice in that situation is to not answer. If you were coming from a bar and you tell them, I'm coming from a bar, that's bad. The most common question that I've seen in a ton of police reports and narratives is, where are you coming from? Where are you going? And a number of my clients, they usually answer the following. Oh, I was just at my friend's house. Okay, what were you doing at your friend's house? Oh, we were having a couple of drinks. Well, the next question is going to be, how many drinks did you have? Or, I was at the bar. Or, I was at Applebee's. You don't have to answer. Be polite, don't be rude, don't be a jerk, but you don't have to answer. Less is more. Typically, when an officer is asking you those questions, they're looking for clues. If you're talking too much, if you're slurring your words, they're looking to see if they could smell alcohol on your breath. Well, how do they smell alcohol on your breath? When you start talking. You can kind of see how talking more in a situation like that does not benefit you in any way, shape, or form. The third thing is the officer is most likely going to ask you for your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. Any attorney will recommend that you give him or her that information. You're required to give him or her that information. And if you refuse to give him or her that information, that could actually escalate the situation. So if you're asked for that information, give it to them. Now, while you're giving the officer your information, it's important to note, like I said earlier, less is more. Don't start talking to him or her about what's going on. Don't talk about your day. Don't talk about anything. Just keep your hands on the steering wheel, hand over that information, and stay quiet. They may ask you more questions. You could simply say, I decline answering any of your questions. You could say it in a polite way. You can be kind. Don't be belligerent. Don't be rude. Don't be condescending. And don't think you know more than the cop in that situation. Like I said, most officers, they don't want to pull you over on a busy highway and conduct a field sobriety test, but they have to. So let's say there's no escaping it and the officer detects that you actually have been drinking. At that point, he or she will order you out of the car. Now, I get asked the question, should I get out of the car? Do I have to get out of the car? The answer is yes. If the officer asks you to step out of that car, you do have to step out of that car. If you refuse to step out of that car, and the officer does have a reasonable suspicion that you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, if you don't step out, that could lead to another charge. And I found that in my experience, when somebody refuses to step out of a vehicle, it escalates the situation. Oftentimes the situation becomes violent. At that point, the officer can use reasonable force to actually remove you from the car, and it doesn't end good for anyone. So in that situation, I would definitely get out of the car and proceed with the officer's instructions. What the officer will most likely do is something called a field sobriety test. And that's when the officer conducts a series of tests to determine whether or not, based off their observation, that you're intoxicated. There's 3 main tests that the officer typically conducts. The first one is the horizontal gaze test. That's just the pen test. That's when the officer holds up the pen and asks you to follow the pen up and down, left and right. Sometimes they'll just do left and right. And what they're looking for is an involuntary jerking of the pupil. That's typically an indicator of being intoxicated. I will tell you this, follow the officer's instructions. Don't do more than what they ask of you, and don't do less of what they ask. Let me give you an example of a case that I had. I had a client who was subject to the horizontal gaze test, okay? And my client wore glasses, and the officer did not ask my client to remove the glasses. So the test was conducted with my client's glasses on. Well, the state police handbook, which most officers use in their training when conducting these tests, requires a person to remove their glasses before conducting that test. Well, guess what? My client was wearing their glasses, they conducted the test, and I was able to get that test thrown out and not taken into consideration. That case did not go to trial, but it helped me negotiate with the prosecutor in coming to some type of resolution for my client's case. So like I said, just follow the officer's lead, don't do more and don't do less. The second test is the one leg stand. That's basically where you hold up one foot and you stand on one leg for 30 seconds. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with that test. I've had clients that are 100% sober and couldn't do the test, whether they had knee problems, whether they were overweight, underweight, super nervous, were having a panic attack. It's not conclusive of being intoxicated, but it's definitely a test that the officer looks at when determining whether or not you're intoxicated. Remain calm and just try to do the test to the best of your ability. The third test that a lot of officers use is the walk and turn test. That's basically where you put one heel in front of the other, get to the end of whatever direction the officer tells you to walk, and then you go ahead and turn around and you do the same thing. Now, it's very important, like I said, follow the officer's directions. The officer tells you to do it 10 times, do it 10 times. Don't do it 12 to show the officer that you can do it 12 times. Don't do it 5 times and tell the officer that I did it 5 times, that's enough, I'm fine. No, the report that the officer writes notes everything that you did during that field sobriety test. If you're being uncooperative, if you're being combative, if you're being a jerk, if you're being condescending, that's all going to be noted in the report. Typically, if you're cooperative, the officer will note that in the report. That'll help me in my discussions with the prosecutor. And if that case ends in trial or leads to a trial, that'll help me during the trial, because I'll ask the officer, hey, when you pulled over my client, did they pull over into a well-lit space? Did they pull over into a wide area where it was safe for everyone? Was my client cooperative? Were they following your instructions? Those are all things that a sober person does. Those are all things that a rational person does. Because like I said, it is not illegal to drink and drive. It is illegal to be intoxicated and drive. Just because you had a drink doesn't mean you're intoxicated. Let's say you go through the field sobriety test and the officer concludes that you are intoxicated and that you are now placed under handcuffs, and the officer concludes that you're intoxicated and they place you under arrest. A lot of people do not realize that not only does the officer have a body cam, but when you get inside of the officer's police vehicle, there's a camera in there, and that camera is actually facing you, and that camera is recording everything that you're saying, and that camera is recording everything that the officer is saying. What I found in my experience is that the officer will, for the most part, be very polite and very kind, and they'll usually ask questions. Well, I'm sorry that this happened. I had to do this. This is my job. I understand that you were drinking. Now, they might get you to admit that you actually drank and that you actually drove, because you think, oh, this is it. I'm done. They've arrested me, whatever. This cop's being friendly. I might as well tell them all my problems. No, your best bet, even more so than when you're being pulled over, is to literally not say a word. The officer can get upset with you. They can get mad, but you don't have to say anything. In fact, you have a Fifth Amendment right not to say anything. So if those cuffs clicked, don't say a word, because it is what it is at that point. What do you do now? You go to the station, they book you, they take your fingerprints, they take your picture. They're most likely going to make you take a breathalyzer test. It's typically in a machine called an alco test machine. You blow into that machine, it gives a reading, but there are requirements before the officer can have you blow into that machine. There's something called an observation period. The observation period in New Jersey is 20 minutes. The officer has to observe you, they have to sit with you, make sure there's nothing in your mouth, blow into that machine, and then that machine will give a reading. That reading, coupled with the field sobriety test, will be enough evidence for them to charge you for DUI. Even though in New Jersey, a DUI is considered a traffic offense and not a criminal offense, you have the same rights as if you committed a criminal offense. This means that the state must prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. However, here's an important distinction. If you're charged with a DUI in New Jersey and it goes to trial, it's a bench trial, meaning that a judge determines your guilt. Whereas in a criminal offense, a jury determines your guilt. Typically, when you're charged with a criminal offense, you're entitled to a jury trial, and that jury would determine whether or not you're guilty or innocent. But like I said, in this situation, in a DUI, you would be found innocent or guilty by a judge. I want to touch on the requirement to provide a breath sample. In New Jersey, there is a requirement to provide a breath sample. There is no requirement to provide a urine or blood sample. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but people ask me all the time, well, if an officer asks me to take a breathalyzer, do I have to? You actually do have to. In New Jersey, you're required to give a breath sample. Now, let's just say you refuse to give a breath sample. That's actually a separate charge. It's almost impossible to beat. When you're faced with that charge, typically your hands are kind of tied and you have to take that charge and move on. Whereas if you do give a breathalyzer sample, an attorney, a good attorney, will be able to kind of reverse engineer that charge and try to find holes in the state's case to either discuss it with the prosecutor and come to some type of resolution, or at trial, an attorney would have the opportunity to cross-examine the officer. They would have an opportunity to scrutinize the breathalyzer test. For example, the machine that conducts the test has to be certified, and there are specific records that are required to be kept with respect to that certification. When an attorney represents a client, they submit something called a request for discovery. Part of that request for discovery is information pertaining to that breathalyzer machine. Simply put, we want to make sure that the machine actually gives an accurate reading. Refusing, that's it. The charge is against you, you get a separate charge for refusing. If you do give a sample of your breath and the reading comes up high, but through discovery we figure out that the machine is actually inoperable or defective or was not serviced correctly, or proper records weren't kept, or the officer did not abide by the observation period requirement, then I have a good chance of getting that case thrown out. But if you refuse, you have no chance. So what did we learn today? Less is more. There's a comedian named Ron White, and he always had a funny line. It said, I had the right to remain silent, but not the ability. Sometimes when people are intoxicated, sometimes they like to talk, they like to hear their own voice. I can't stress it enough. Less is more. Number 2, do things that a sober person would do. I know that's easy to say. You've had a couple of drinks in you. Sometimes, the worst version of yourself comes out, but try your best to keep that in your mind. What would a sober person do? Would a sober person act belligerent? Would a sober person get out of their car and yell at the cop? Some sober people do, but keep that in your mind when you're dealing with this situation. And third, once you're arrested, once those cuffs go on, stop talking. Don't say anything. Follow the officer's instructions, be as kind as possible, be as cooperative as possible, and most importantly, hire an attorney that knows what they're doing and has experience navigating a DUI in the state of New Jersey. If you like this video and you want to see more, comment down below. Otherwise, hit the like button, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.